Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active. That way he could race against Brexton. To have that moment of symbolization for Kyle and just see Brexton standing there, there's a moment of, wow, he's gone. And we're not going to get him back.
A man who spent almost 2 decades trading paint with his own brother on some of the fastest ovals in America had to stand in front of a camera months later and describe the moment he finally accepted that his brother was never coming home. That is where this story actually begins, not with a race, but with a phone that would not stop buzzing on a Thursday afternoon in May, carrying news that nobody in the NASCAR world was prepared for. Kyle Busch, one of the most successful drivers the sport has ever produced, was gone at 41, and the brother who knew him best would spend the rest of the year trying to put that loss into words. By the time you finish this video, you will understand exactly what Kurt Busch has said publicly since that day, what actually happened to Kyle in his final week, and why this loss has hit the racing community as hard as almost anything in the sport's modern history. To understand why Kurt's words carry so much weight, you have to understand what these two brothers built together. Kurt and Kyle Busch grew up in Las Vegas, the sons of Tom Busch, a mechanic who raced stock cars on the side and who put both of his boys behind the wheel of go-karts before they were old enough for much else. Kurt was the older brother by roughly 7 years, and he blazed the trail first, working his way up through Legends cars and late models before landing a NASCAR opportunity that eventually made him the 2004 Cup Series champion. Kyle followed the same path a few years later, and by the time he was a young teenager, he was already serving as crew chief on Kurt's dwarf car team, soaking up everything he could about how the sport actually worked from the inside. When Kyle finally got his own shot in NASCAR's National Series, Kurt was already telling anyone who would listen that his little brother was going to be the better driver in the family, and history proved him right in almost every measurable way. What followed was one of the most competitive sibling rivalries any American sport has ever seen. The two men raced against each other at NASCAR's highest level for more than a decade, occasionally wrecking each other in the process, most famously during a heated 2007 All-Star race incident that reportedly kept them from speaking for months until their grandmothers stepped in to patch things up. But underneath the competitiveness was a real bond, one built on shared history, shared pressure, and a shared last name that neither of them ever tried to escape. By the time both men had established themselves as two of the winningest drivers of their generation, they had also become the only pair of brothers in NASCAR history to each record more than 30 Cup Series victories individually, a fact that made their combined legacy essentially untouchable. That legacy reached a new peak in January of 2026, when Kurt Busch was formally inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Photographs from that night show the two brothers standing together on the red carpet, smiling, with Kyle right there to celebrate a moment his older brother had worked toward for decades. Nobody in that room could have imagined that only a few months later, that same image would be circulating again for an entirely different reason. By the spring of 2026, Kyle Busch was in his 4th season driving the number 8 Chevrolet for Richard Childress Racing, still competing at the highest level more than 2 decades into his career, and still adding to a win total that no one else in the sport's history could match. On May 10th, while racing at Watkins Glen, Busch could be heard over his in-car radio asking his team to have a doctor meet him after the race so he could get a shot, a request that at the time looked like nothing more than a driver dealing with a stubborn sinus infection or a lingering cold. He told reporters afterward that he was still getting over it, but the schedule of a professional NASCAR driver does not leave much room for rest, and Busch kept working. Less than a week later, he won a Truck Series race at Dover, adding yet another victory to what was already the most dominant National Series resume in NASCAR history. 2 days after that, he competed in the Cup Series All-Star race, finishing 17th. He even made time to attend a go-kart track opening with his 11-year-old son Brexton, the same kind of family moment that had defined so much of his life away from the track. From the outside, everything looked ordinary. A busy, in-demand driver, managing what appeared to be a minor illness, while preparing for one of the sport's biggest events of the year, the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. Then came Wednesday, May 20th. Busch was at a racing simulator facility in Concord, North Carolina, going through preparation work ahead of the Charlotte race, when he became unresponsive. According to emergency call audio later obtained by reporters, A caller described Busch experiencing shortness of breath, overheating, and coughing up blood, and said he had been found lying on a bathroom floor but was still conscious and talking. Paramedics transported him to a hospital in Charlotte. Busch's family and his race team said only that he had been hospitalized with a severe illness and would not be competing in the upcoming race. Less than 24 hours after that call, on Thursday, May 21st, 2026, Kyle Busch died. He was 41 years old. The news spread through the NASCAR community almost instantly, and the shock was visible everywhere. Drivers who had spent their careers racing against Busch, some of them former rivals and some of them close friends, began posting tributes within hours. Denny Hamlin, who had been teammates with Busch earlier in both of their careers, said he could not comprehend the news and asked people to think of the family. Dale Earnhardt Jr., who had clashed with Busch on the track for years before the two developed a genuine friendship built around short track and late model racing, posted that Busch was one of the greatest drivers in NASCAR history, but was also a father, a husband, a brother, and a son, and that his heart was broken for the entire Busch family. NASCAR itself released a joint statement with Richard Childress Racing, calling Busch a rare, once-in-a-generation talent and extending condolences to Kurt and the rest of the Busch family by name. 2 days after Kyle's death, the family released a statement explaining what had actually happened medically. The evaluation they received concluded that severe pneumonia had progressed into sepsis, resulting in rapid and overwhelming complications. A death certificate later obtained by reporters filled in more of the picture. Busch had reportedly been dealing with symptoms of bacterial pneumonia for days, possibly weeks, before sepsis finally took hold. Sepsis itself is a serious, sometimes fatal medical emergency in which the body's own immune system, rather than simply fighting off an infection, begins attacking its own tissue and organs. In Busch's case, that cascade led to a rare blood clotting disorder called disseminated intravascular coagulation, which in turn caused hemorrhagic shock. Doctors who reviewed similar cases afterward noted just how quickly this kind of complication can move once it takes hold, which helps explain why a driver who had been racing competitively just days earlier could go from a hospital admission to gone within a single day. The manner of death was ultimately listed as natural causes, and Busch was cremated in Mooresville, North Carolina, following an autopsy. For sport built around visible, physical risk, one where fans and drivers alike understand the danger of what happens on the track, the idea that an ordinary-looking sinus infection could take the life of one of its most accomplished competitors within a matter of days was almost impossible for people close to Kyle to process. And nobody had to process that harder than his own brother. Kurt Busch did not speak publicly right away. For more than 2 weeks after Kyle's death, he stayed quiet. Even as tributes from teammates, rivals, and NASCAR officials continued to pour in, and even as Richard Childress spoke publicly about a contract extension conversation with Kyle that had been in the works before everything changed. It was not until Monday, June 8th, that Kurt finally posted his first public statement, sharing it on Instagram alongside a collage of family photographs spanning decades, from childhood shots to images from their competing years in NASCAR. He thanked fans and well-wishers for the outpouring of support the family had received, and he reflected on growing up racing anything the two of them could get their hands on, from backyard go-karts as kids all the way up to competing against each other on NASCAR's biggest stages as adults. He described their relationship as something that went far beyond fierce competition, writing that they pushed each other, challenged each other, and learned from each other throughout their lives. He said no championship or accomplishment could ever measure the impact his younger brother had on his life, and that his heart was broken, but that he knew Kyle's spirit would always be with him. He closed the post with a simple, direct line to his younger brother, "Rest easy." Kyle's widow, Samantha Busch, had already broken her own silence a few days earlier, posting her own statement on Instagram, in which she described the outpouring of prayers, flowers, meals, and small acts of kindness as something that had carried the family through the hardest days of their lives, while thanking the public for showing up for their 2 children, Brexton and Lennox, in the weeks after their father's death. Kurt has echoed that same gratitude nearly every time he has spoken about Kyle's family since. Kurt's grief resurfaced in an even more visible, unfiltered way roughly 3 months later, in mid-August, When a preview clip from a NASCAR docuseries called NASCAR Americana was released ahead of its second episode. In the clip, Kurt grew visibly emotional while talking about how fatherhood had reshaped Kyle's priorities in the final years of his life. He explained that as Brexton got older and began racing competitively himself, Kyle made a point of staying active and staying sharp specifically so that he could one day race against his own son, much the same way their father Tom had pushed both of the Busch brothers into the sport decades earlier. Kurt described watching Brexton stand beside Samantha during the tribute NASCAR held for Kyle before the first race following his death, and he admitted, through visible tears, that seeing his young nephew in that moment was what finally forced the reality to sink in, that his brother was truly gone and was not coming back. That tribute itself, held before the Coca-Cola 600 just days after Kyle's passing, turned what would have been an ordinary Memorial Day weekend race into something closer to a public memorial. Every driver in the field carried a decal in Kyle's honor, and NASCAR's chief executive addressed the family directly before the race began, acknowledging the scale of what the sport had just lost. Kurt appeared at the ceremony alongside his parents, Samantha, and Kyle's 2 children, laying white roses across a number 8 logo that had been painted into the track's infield grass in Kyle's honor. It was one of the first public moments where cameras captured Kurt processing the loss in real time, well before he had said anything publicly about it himself. To understand why this loss has resonated so far beyond the Busch family, it helps to look at exactly what Kyle accomplished over more than 2 decades behind the wheel. By the time of his death, he stood as the winningest driver in NASCAR history across its 3 national touring series combined, with 234 total victories spanning the Cup Series, the Xfinity Level Series, and the Truck Series.